They Followed Me, submitted by Denise P. I was an RA at a university in Tennessee. I'm a female, and I was 20 years old at the time, and a junior. As much as I loved being an RA for my dorm, one thing that sucked is you had to wait for all of the residents to leave after dead week and exams before you could go home for your holidays and winter break. When this happened, it was 2010, and for whatever reason, the last exam that was posted for anyone on campus was December 21st, which was a Tuesday. It was also scheduled for 5 p.m., which meant that anyone in our dorm who was taking that exam might not be back until 6:30 or maybe 7. And that sucked for us RAs because it meant if those students didn't leave immediately, we could be stuck there till late evening or even have to stay an extra day before we could go home. Despite all my worry and desire to get out as quick as I could, it worked out that our RD told all of us that we could leave by 9 p.m. regardless of anyone staying later, making arrangements to leave and go wherever they were going for winter break. I lived in Camden, Tennessee, about 4.5 hours away from where I was going to school, so I was debating back and forth whether it made sense to leave at 9 or 9:30 and drive through the night, or just wait until the next morning to leave. I finally opted for the first choice and helped my RD check all of the rooms I was in charge of, looking around to see if the windows were locked, nothing was plugged in, and all the doors were secure. I did my paperwork and finally packed up my little Impreza and started for home at close to 10, figuring I'd be home around 2:30 in the morning. Thankfully, I'd prepared the day before by filling up with gas and getting some soda and snacks so I wouldn't have to stop on the way home for anything unless I needed a pee break. I left campus, made my way onto Interstate 40 and headed west. I was super excited to go home and have time off before having to go back before the other students, as all RAs usually have to do. Our break is never as long as the people who live in the dorms. Things were going along smoothly, and I was just listening to a mixed CD that I had made. Oh my god, I just said CD. As I made my way past Kingston, a black Malibu came flying onto the interstate from the on-ramp and nearly ran into me. I was tired, but I was paying attention, and I just moved out of the way into the left lane and let them go ahead of me in the right lane. I remember reaching for a bag of Sun Chips, and then looking up to see the car slowing down in front of me. There wasn't a ton of traffic, but it wasn't exactly dead on the highway. But there was no real reason for these people to put on the brakes. And after they slowed down to like 35, the car took off again, and I lost them in the distance as they were really moving. I didn't think anything of it, just thought maybe they were also looking for something in their car and didn't realize they had slowed down as much as they did. I've been known to do that myself. About 5 or 6 miles later, I saw a car on the side of the road with its flashers on, so I moved to the left lane again as soon as I could. Couldn't help but notice it was the same black Malibu that had gotten onto the road in Kingston. I just kept motoring along, thinking about sleeping in my own bed and seeing my friends and family. A little while later, I noticed a car move from the left lane into the right lane where I was driving, and it got right behind me. And I mean right behind me. Tailgating like all hell, even though there was no one in the left lane and no reason to be behind me. I sped up a little to give myself a cushion, but the car sped up as well. After about a mile or so of this car tailgating me, it moved into the left lane and pulled alongside me. I looked over briefly to see who was in the car, but the windows were very tinted and I couldn't see anything. The Malibu stayed right alongside me for another mile or so, even though I tried to drop back or speed up. They matched whatever I was doing, whoever it was at the wheel. Finally, a semi-truck was up ahead of me in the right lane, and I had to slow down for obviously I couldn't move into the left lane. The car stayed right alongside me until we were right behind the semi, and then it shot ahead. I was now a little nervous about this, as it was not normal behavior for anybody on the road to do that. So I called my parents on my cell phone, but they didn't answer, so I just left a message. Then I tried my brother, and he also didn't answer his phone. I then called one of my best friends, and she thankfully answered, and I told her what was going on. She too thought it was very odd, but told me to just be safe and not do anything stupid. She said if it got any worse and they continued to play games, wait until I could get off the road and take an exit before they could react to what I was doing. She assured me that it wasn't going to be necessary, but it was just something that her father had told her to do if anything had ever happened to her on the road. We kept talking as she wanted to be there for me, knowing I was freaked out, and I appreciated that. It was about an hour later that I realized I did have to stop for a pee break, and I did so in a town called Gordonsville, where I knew there was a big truck stop. I also kind of wanted to stretch my legs after a 2-hour section of driving. I pulled off the road into the parking lot, and got out and immediately did a few stretches before walking into the building. It was a little after midnight, and I did what I had to do, decided to get a cup of coffee, and then went back out to my car. Before I got in, I looked to the edge of the lot to my right and saw a black Malibu parked there. At the time, to be honest, I couldn't 100% be sure it was the same car. I mean, how many black Malibus are there out there? Hundreds, thousands. But it made me a little nervous, and I tried calling my parents again before I took off. My mom answered the phone, and I told her where I was and what was going on, and that I thought someone was following me or just at least messing with me on the road. She gave the phone to my father after telling me that I just needed to relax and I should just get back on the road and get home. But my dad was a little bit different and started asking questions. He asked me if I could get the license plate to the car and take a note of it, and also look for any distinctive marks on the car if they were there. My dad is an insurance salesman and is always looking for stuff like this. He has an eye for detail and has had experience with so many accidents and things like this that he knows what to look for. I looked over at the Malibu that was pointed at my car, but there was no front license plate. I told him that the windows were heavily tinted, but it must be the same car. That was all I could tell about it. He just said, "Okay, be safe, but check in with us every half hour or so for the next 2 hours of the drive, just to be sure." I told him that I didn't think that was necessary, that I'd be okay, and I knew that they both had to work in the morning. But he said, "Just do it. It'll make me feel better." I said okay, and then got back on the road. After a few miles, I realized that the roads were a lot more sparse than they were earlier. It was easy to see the lights behind me that were coming up rapidly. Again, it was the same thing. The car started tailgating me when no one was in the left-hand lane. I started getting more nervous, thinking it was the same car, and, lo and behold, a moment later, when it pulled around the side of me, it was the same black Malibu. This time, when I looked over, the passenger window was down, and someone in the passenger seat flicked a cigarette at my car. Obviously, it didn't really do much and blew away pretty fast, but when I looked over again, I could see 2 women in the driver's and passenger seat. An arm came out of the window, and a hand pointed at me before the car took off again, doing at least 90 to 95 miles an hour, as I was doing an easy 75. So began an hour of them speeding up, dropping back, speeding up, dropping back, getting in front of me, slowing down, the whole gamut of bullshit angry driver stuff. I called my dad and told him what was happening, and he said the same things again, try to get a license plate, and then to call the THP, and he was going to do the same thing. The car sped off into the distance, and I got off at an exit I don't remember, but I called the THP and made a report after I repeated the make and model of the car with the license plate. They said they'd be on the lookout for it and to call back if I saw it again. They asked if there was any damage to my car or if I felt threatened, and I said yes to the second question. I was more than nervous now, and frankly, I was waiting for that car to show up again. They had about another hour and 15 minutes to go before I got home, and my mom stayed on the line with me the entire way when I called her back. I didn't see that car again at all, but the longer the time went on between the last time I saw them and now, I started to calm down. At long last, at about 2:40 in the morning, I was off the interstate and making my way through town to my house. I pulled into the driveway and breathed a sigh of relief. Grabbed some stuff while leaving a bunch in the car, as I didn't feel like unpacking everything that late in the morning. I just wanted to get inside, see my parents, and take a shower. I was dead tired and ready for bed. I saw my parents and told them that I would talk to them more in the morning, and that I felt bad that they were up over my stupid trip home. I hit the bathroom, got cleaned up, and as I went into my room, I turned on my bedroom light and saw that my mom had turned down my bed for me. She's so cute, and that made me smile. I turned off the light, and still smiling, moved to the side of my bed, and that's when the smile ran from my face. Out of my window that looked over the front yard of our home, I saw a black Malibu parked in front of my house. I didn't mean to, but I screamed, and my parents came running in, and I pointed out the window and said, "That's the car! That's the car! Somehow they know I'm here!" My brother had also gotten up and had no idea what was going on, but when I kept repeating, "The car is outside! The car is outside!" he immediately ran downstairs, but by the time he got out into the yard and by the time my parents had a chance to see the car, it took off like a bat out of hell, screeching its tires. My dad and I called the local police and told them what had happened on my way home, and that we had filed a report with the THP. They said they'd be on the lookout for the car, but they weren't sure if there was anything they could do, as it would be my word against them, and there was nothing in the law against a car being parked in front of a house. About an hour and a half later, I finally decided that I could go to sleep. My dad stayed up because he said he couldn't sleep, but in my heart of hearts, I knew that even as though I was a grown woman, he was trying to protect me. The next day, we followed up with the police, but they had nothing to share with us. They said they would continue to look for the vehicle of that description with the license plate. It was the last time I saw that car, and to this day I cannot figure out who it was, why they followed me, and how they knew where I lived. As far as I knew, they should have been farther down the interstate long before I got off an exit to get near my hometown. How they got back on the road behind me, I will never know. My holiday vacation was good, and each day after that incident made things better. But when I do look back on this, it still creeps me out. What did those women want? And what would have happened if I hadn't noticed them out there parked in the street in front of my house? And what would have happened if my brother hadn't run out there and chased them away? It's things that I don't like to think about. The Monster in the Woods, submitted by Keith Racer. Christmas of 1982 was awesome for me. I was 17 and really into dirt bikes, and my parents had surprised me for good grades, my birthday, which also was in December, and Christmas. They bought me a new Honda CR125R bike. I lived north of Ocala, Florida, and there were lots of ranches and farms up there off of US 441. Lots of trails and places for me and my friends to ride. We had built jumps and other obstacles like whoop-de-whoops and berms to race around on, and I was over the moon to have a new bike. My mom and dad's side of the family both came to our house for Christmas, and I was really jazzed, because my cousin Jamie was going to be there, and I thought he could use my old Kawasaki. We'd go out for a spin before everyone sat down for presents and dinner. I also called my best friend Steven, told him about my new bike. He was very happy for me. He also had the same one. When my cousins and aunts and uncles got to our house, they were all waiting for my grandparents to come up from Orlando. I took advantage of this and told my dad that Jamie and I were going to go out and meet my friend Steve for a little fun. He told us to just make sure we wore our gear and to be safe, but he could feel the excitement radiating off of me, and frankly, I could see how excited he was for me too. So, we got suited up. I called Steven and told him to meet us at one of the trails we had built. It had a decent-sized jump. I really wanted to test out my new baby. Jamie and I took off, and I immediately fell in love with that bike. I know this has nothing to do with the story, but I still have that bike. Actually, my son has it, and I hope he has a son that he can hand it down to. It's nothing fancy, but it's one of those things that I always hope stays in the family. We got to the track that we had set up, and while Jamie was into bikes, he was not as much of a daredevil as Steven and I were. So while we were pushing the limits and launching ourselves from jump to jump, trying to do tabletops and stuff like that, he was just kind of cruising around on some of the other obstacles we had made. On the other side of one of the berms we had built, there was a little pond and marsh, and it had a thick set of trees on the other side. Our engines were slicing through the quiet Christmas afternoon, and we decided to take a fast break before a couple of more jumps, knowing we had to head home sooner or later. I looked over, and I saw Jamie just kind of sitting on top of one of the berms we had made. His bike was at the base of it. I rode over, and as I did, he was waving his hand but pointing downwards like telling me to be quiet. I cut my engine and went up to see what he was doing, and Steven followed suit behind me. When we crawled to the top of the berm, I whispered to Jamie, "What are you doing?" He pointed across the pond to the trees. And for the first time in my life, I became a believer. Standing there in the swampy part of the pond was what I can only call a creature. A creature that has a lot of names, including Bigfoot, but around here, everyone called them skunk apes. I'd made fun of my share of friends and relatives who said that they had seen something like this, but now, here on Christmas afternoon of 1982, I was seeing what they had always talked about. The thing was big. It was about 70 yards away or so, but you could tell it had to have weighed at least 300 or 400 pounds and was towering over the water plants that I knew were at least 6 feet tall, having been in the pond before when I was fishing. It sort of just swayed there for a minute, and I don't think it had any idea that we were watching it. I'm pretty sure that it probably heard our bikes and maybe came over to investigate. And one thing that I've been told all my life is that while they are elusive, skunk apes are also very inquisitive, especially when it comes to foreign sounds or people being in their territory. Well, we watched it for another few minutes, not saying a word, and that's when we noticed it starting to walk through the water around the edge of the pond towards us. It didn't seem to be paying any attention to us, as I said, but I could tell Jamie was getting a little scared. I don't think he bargained for something like this, and neither did I, to be honest. But for whatever reason, Stephen and I were taking it a little more in stride, even though we were both kind of scared and in awe. As the thing got closer to us, it finally did look up at the top of the berm and stopped. We couldn't see any facial features, but we knew it was looking right at us. For a moment, it didn't do anything, but then it let out a howl like I've never heard again ever in my life. I've been hunting, I've even been on safari, and I've never heard a howl quite like it. In the best way I can describe it, it was a mix between a man and a primate, but it was very, very angry. After it howled, it started moving towards us, and it didn't take much for us to lose it, slide down the berm and jump on our bikes. We all got on them at the same time and kick-started them to life, and we heard that howl again. And when I looked over my shoulder before taking off, this thing was coming over the edge of the berm, and I knew if we didn't take off right then, we'd be in serious trouble. Stephen was in the lead, Jamie was in the middle, and I was in the rear. We raced alongside our little track, skipping all of the obstacles and the jumps, just trying to get the heck out of there as fast as we could. After about a quarter of a mile, I stopped and turned around to see the thing standing on one of the far jumps. Again, it was just swaying there, but it was clear it was not going to chase us any further. Jamie came back alongside me, and we both watched as it turned and walked into the woods on the side of our man-made trail. We didn't say a word, it just turned and headed for home. We all got back to my house and went inside, bursting with what had just happened and telling everyone what we had seen. It drew a couple of laughs from my family, but Stephen was adamant and said, "No, you guys don't really get it. That thing is out there somewhere." I suppose it makes sense for me to tell you that our house was about 2 miles from where we saw the thing. So as teenagers, we were still kind of worried that maybe this thing would wander over towards my house. Finally, Stephen had to go home, and Jamie and I got cleaned up after things calmed down. My uncle, Jamie's father, was one of the people who had said that he had seen a skunk ape when he was a kid, and was one of the adults that didn't give us the business when we told him about what we had just seen. He pulled us aside later, bourbon in hand, and asked us to tell the story again. He asked us to describe the thing and kept shaking his head saying, Yep, that sounds about right." We told him that we were worried that the thing might come to the house, and he said that he didn't think that was going to happen. That was my first and last encounter with Bigfoot, skunk ape, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I don't think anyone else in my group of friends or family ever saw anything out there again, and we continued to ride at all hours of the day despite that first few times being a little worried that it might show up again. But it never did. It was a great Christmas because of the bike, and now in my memories it's even cooler because I got to see something that not a lot of people do. 2 great Christmas presents. The Banging on the Back Door, submitted by Allie. This is short, but I wanted to send it in anyway. About 4 years ago, my family was getting ready to celebrate Christmas at our house. We had popcorn and cookies and also watched Christmas Vacation. It was really a fun night, as my brother had just gotten back from being overseas in the Army. We all went to bed to get ready for the next day, but around 2 o'clock, all of us were awakened by a massive pounding on our back door. I say back door, but I mean our entire back house. It felt like the entire back of the house was being shaken to its foundations. All of us got up and immediately ran out into our upstairs hallway. Of course, we all looked at each other like, what the heck was that? But that was before my brother and father ran downstairs to see what was going on. My mom and I ran down after them, but my dad and Mark were much quicker than us, and they were armed with firearms that we had hidden in our house. I know firearms outside of a safe are a hot topic these days, but we kept them hidden, but also accessible for situations like this. I have to say, the pounding that we heard was so severe that it actually knocked some things off of our kitchen counter that my mom had left out overnight. We live in the country, and we just have a deck that comes right up to the back of our house where there are a set of French doors that open into our dining room. By the time my mom and I got downstairs, my dad and Mark had the back floodlights on, and we could see that there were footsteps in the snow coming from the woods right behind our house. There was only one set of footprints, and when my mom asked my dad if he had opened the back door, he said no, and we saw that there was snow coming in from the outside, but the footsteps stopped at the edge of the tile of our kitchen that was right next to our dining room. The house was as quiet as a church on a Tuesday evening, and we all stood listening to see if we could hear anything else. And we didn't. There were no more sounds. We couldn't explain what had happened and why the back door was open and why there was snow tracked into the house. My dad and brother went over the entire place with a fine-tooth comb but found nothing. There was no one in the house despite the fact that it looked a lot like someone had come in through the back door. I also have to point out that there were no retreating tracks in the snow back into the woods. Whatever had come up to our house and banged on the back door or the back of the house, it did so, entered, but left with no trace. My brother stayed up the entire night and kept walking around the house looking for any trace or evidence of something, but he never found or came up with anything. To this day, we have no idea what that was, and only have our cell phone pictures of a set of footsteps coming up to our house in the snow, and the memory of the pounding on the back door. We ended up having a great Christmas anyway, but we are still freaked out wondering what had actually happened the night before. Christmas Ghost, submitted by Derek's Dominoes. This is more weird than scary, but I think it's fitting to send to you at Christmas. I'm a new subscriber, and I like how you say that you read all the stories that are sent to you, and perhaps I'm putting you to the test. My grandfather died when I was 7 years old. I still have fond memories of him and the times that I did get to spend with him and my grandmother. They lived 2 streets over from my parents when I was growing up, and they took care of me and my little sister all the time. My grandfather got sick on my 7th birthday, and while we thought that he would recover, that wasn't to be, and he passed away on December 4th of that year. My grandmother was devastated. He was only 58 at the time, and since this happened, and now that I'm much older, I've had conversations with her, and her biggest fear was not that she couldn't get along without him. It was her fear that she would have to live another lifetime without him. Him not being around was the worst fear that she had in mind. And she was a tough cookie, and still is trucking along at 88 today. She still lives in the same house, still works part-time at the same job, still volunteers at her church, and is just an awesome lady. But she still had one quirk. She always set a place setting for my grandfather every Christmas because that was his favorite holiday. When she first did it, I remember my dad, and that was his mom, asking her why she was doing that. And after 2 or 3 years, he actually pulled her aside and questioned her about holding on to the past and not moving forward. By then I was 10 and much more aware of my surroundings, and I remember her saying to my father that she wasn't holding on to the past. She just wanted that day to be special, for my grandfather, for her, and just to let her do what she wanted to do. My dad backed off, and the tradition went on. Every Christmas, there was a place setting for my grandfather. On the 5th year that he was gone, we were having Christmas at my grandmother's house, as we always did. My uncle and cousins came in from Iowa to spend the holiday with us, and an extra couple of days too. We lived in Chicago. There was always lots to do, and it was super exciting, not only to have presents and all the awesome food, but there was always fun trips and places to go with my cousins. Like always, Grandma left a place setting at the head of the table, and when we sat down to eat, my grandmother said grace. We all dug in, and no one noticed that the glass that my grandmother had set out for my grandfather was no longer at the side of his plate, and when we looked, it was now on top of it. That was something he always did when he was finished eating. I don't know why, but when he was done with his meal, he would drain his glass of water or whatever it was that he was drinking, and then put it on top of his plate. My mother was the first one to notice it, and pointed it out, and asked if my grandmother had done that on purpose as some sort of acknowledgement or tribute to my grandfather. My grandmother just looked at it, turned pale, and said, "I didn't do that." The skeptic in me, even at such an early age, immediately made me think that it was just an oversight. My grandmother really did do that, and she just forgot about it. But, at the same time, I was kind of in awe that it happened. No one said another word about it, and we just kept on eating. But I heard my dad and uncle talking about it later while my mom and grandmother were doing dishes, and I was just trying to help out in the kitchen. The two of them were still in the dining room having a beer and smoking cigarettes, talking about what I had just noticed and what everyone else had seen as well. The next year, we convinced my grandmother to have Christmas at our house, and she reluctantly agreed as long as she could help with the cooking and baking and all that stuff that grandmothers are so good at. She made my mom promise to have a place setting for my grandfather, and my mother said it was not a problem. When we had dinner, we were all laughing and telling funny family stories, and my grandmother was sharing funny things that my grandfather did when they first got together. This time, I was the one to notice that the glass that my mother had put out was now on top of my grandfather's plate, as were the pieces of silverware that had been lined up so neatly on either side of it. It was just like he had finished a meal and was waiting for someone to take away his plate. We'd never experienced anything strange or paranormal in our house, so this was a first, and my skepticism as a kid was starting to be whittled away. No one had been anywhere near my grandfather's place setting, and we had no explanation for how that had happened. For the next couple of years, we went back and forth between my grandmother's house and ours. We always had a place setting out, but nothing ever happened with my grandfather. So I think in the backs of our minds, we all chalked it up to someone just maybe doing something and forgetting that they had actually done it. I'll skip ahead to when I was a senior in high school. We were having Christmas at our house that year, and in an effort to streamline that day and make more time for presents and that sort of thing, as my sister had just had her first child, I set all of the plates, glasses, and silverware the night before. The dining room was all set, and it was just something that I wanted to help out my mom with. That night, I woke up at around 1 a.m. on Christmas, and to hear our front door open and close. I heard footsteps walk across our hardwood floors, and I swear I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back in the dining room. For a moment, I thought it was my dad who was trying to sneak in some presents or something. I got up, went to the bathroom and got a glass of water, and then went back to sleep after turning on my radio to listen to some music. About an hour later, I woke up again to hear the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors, and the front door open and close again. This time, my curiosity was piqued, and I had to go downstairs. When I did, all was quiet and dark. And of course it was. It was about 2:30 in the morning. So I just went to get a glass of milk in the kitchen, and I walked through the dining room and then turned on the light to guide my way. I couldn't believe what I saw. The place setting that we had laid out for my grandfather had been disrupted. The water glass and the silverware were now on top of his plate, just like it had been years before. My mother came down to see if I was okay. She noticed that I had woken up and had come downstairs, and I pointed out what was going on in the dining room. She just stood there with her hand in her mouth and quietly walked over to the place setting, picked it up, and took it off the table. She told me to put the glass back into the china cabinet and put the silverware back in its box. And that was the last time we set out a place for my grandfather. When my mother told my grandmother about it, she said that it was finally time that tradition had stopped. And she wasn't angry with my mom, and she wasn't sad. But when I told her the story about the door opening and closing and the footsteps, she was convinced that it was my grandfather finally saying goodbye, as my sister and I had finally grown up, and he no longer needed to watch over us. I have no explanation for how any of that happened, but it doesn't matter. I'm still a staunch skeptic, but I saw what I saw, and regardless of what it was or why it happened, it was a comforting thing to think that my grandfather was still with us at the time.
Thanks for listening, guys. Merry Christmas. I'm going to keep this short and sweet, straight to the point. If you've got a true scary story you'd like me to narrate, email unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I also hope that you like this thumbnail for this one. I painted this years ago, just happened to find it in my basement and thought, boy, what a perfect way to actually add something to the background for some Christmas stories. Everybody, be excellent to each other. And until the next time, remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.